call Brother Russ to be here, and also we are going to tell everyone to keep attention to Brother Russ.
Good morning, everyone. Happy Mother's Day again, and hopefully I'll have something to say about that a little later too. And I guess greetings to everyone that's online and streaming. It's good to know that you're on too, and it's good to know that we can come together and meet and keep our Savior Jesus in remembrance. From the hymn we just sang. The living know that they shall die. And you get to be my age, you begin to think about that a lot more than you might think. So it's indeed a real privilege that we can meet together. And if it's something like you don't have in the future, then you realize how important it is now. So the title again that Brother Ramazani brought out and the reading that he gave, he said, "For I, the Lord, do not change." That's from Malachi 3:6. And the reason I came to this talk is in my daily readings. When we do our daily readings, you read them a lot of different times. And then I think most of you know that sometime when you read through it, it's like, wow, bingo, something just ringed a bell there. And it's maybe something that you want to look into. So this kind of came about a couple months ago, actually back in March, doing the daily readings, or the Robert Roberts daily readings. And I think these two, Numbers 5 and Luke 16, kind of come up together in those readings. So I'm looking at it and I'm thinking to myself, something doesn't seem consistent here. And the reason I say that is we know from the title is God says, I don't change. And yet in the two readings, it's almost, at least to me, seems as though there might be some inconsistency there. Or I could see how someone looking at that could say, well, I don't know if that's consistent in these two passages. So in Luke 16, when it talks about the rich man and Lazarus, that allegory that's there, that parable, so to speak, we get introduced to this rich man who feasts every day. And he's clothed in purple, so we know that he's not just nobody. He's somebody up there. And this man Lazarus said, I'd really like to have some food off the table, right? So a hard quiz here. Can anybody remember anybody else that said, I'd like food off your table that Jesus visited? Bruce seems to know. The Syrophoenician woman. Yeah. She wanted it too, right? So got a Gentile, and I think in this Luke passage, we pretty much know that he's talking to the Jews, probably the Pharisees more specifically, yet his disciples are, they're probably listening to this whole message that's going on there. So we know in the Luke passage also that Jesus had accused the Pharisees of being lovers of money, which they apparently were. And as chapter 16 begins, they scoff at him like, no, he doesn't know what he's talking about. And it kind of brought me back to Proverbs 6, where it says, he who, and this assuming comes from Solomon, he who reproves the scoffer gets himself abuse. So that's kind of what Jesus got from him, abuse, when he told them what they actually were. And through this particular allegory, if you look at the context of it, and believe me, I've read through it several times, and I've kind of missed this. It's almost like, are you that stupid, Russ, in a way? Yeah, I did miss it. And I think what the real point here is, you can get involved in the detail of the minutia of who is, Lazarus, was that Lazarus Jesus know, or did he make that up? Or did they believe, as we know, he gets into the allegory, did they believe in going to hell? Or, what's the detail? What really happened, with Moses and Abraham at the end? But I think what really might be the main point in the context of the warning is, why didn't you invite Lazarus to dinner? It talks about the feast, but I kind of would read through it and I don't really see that. But I think that might be the main point that he's trying to get across to them. You should have invited him to eat with you. He's begging for what comes off the table. But the Pharisees didn't see him as an acceptable person, right? The dogs are licking the sores off this guy. Lazarus, that can't be good. And we also know that Jesus had told them, and a little bit like I read earlier about they were lovers of money, he told them that they couldn't serve God and they couldn't serve mammon at the same time. Can't do both. And I think we all have struggled with that at times, knowing that that can't be the case. Because Jesus says it's impossible. You cannot do this. And so this situation with Lazarus kind of reminds me of Job in the Old Testament, right? Job had sores. His friends were there to help him and help him out. But as time went on, it's like, oh, Job, I think you might have done something really wrong here, because otherwise this wouldn't happen to you. And you can also think of the situation, or at least I do, in the New Testament, the man born blind, right? Remember the disciples like, well, who sinned? Did he sin, or did his parents sin? Somebody sinned, or it wouldn't be this way. And so these abnormalities of physicality that they had, Job specifically and the man born blind, they were cast out. Can't go to the temple, right, because of that situation. And it kind of goes hand in hand in a way with what's happening in the book of Numbers. And if we get into that, I didn't have it read this morning, but you get into the jealousy thing. And if you ever read this in mixed company about jealousy, I'm talking about how, women and men on that, it always comes to, it's always kind of fun in a way. It always comes to the women like, why are we the ones that have to, get singled out on this, that have to drink the bitter waters? And the guys are always kind of, yeah, I don't really know, but they kind of keep silent. But I think as you go through it, I think both say that the Lord doesn't punish somebody more than he punishes somebody else. So in essence, I think you come to the conclusion the guys don't get off, that they get found out also. So this isn't something that happens that way. But the point of the bitter waters, I think, is, what was read earlier by our brother was that things that had abnormalities had to be outside the camp, because God's saying, I don't want them inside the camp. Can't be that way. So drinking these bitter waters as you go on, I think shows that inside the camp, God's not happy with people that are with unseen issues. So if I have leprosy, or I have blind, that's something everybody notices. But you don't notice too much if there's somebody's being unfaithful to their partner. So in essence, I think God's saying, I see all of that, and that's really not acceptable for me either, but I'm going to shine a light on that, and that's one of the ways he does that. So I think that shines a light, this unfaithful thing shines a light about why the unclean need to be outside the camp. So this Numbers 5 reference that was read, the Lord said to Moses, that was read earlier, command the people of Israel that they put outside the camp every leper and everyone having a discharge and everyone that is unclean through contact with the dead. You shall put out both male and female, putting them outside the camp, that they may not defile the camp in the midst of which I dwell. And I think that's one of the key points I think a brother brought out to me, that they cannot defile the camp in the midst where I dwell. So he's saying where I dwell, it's not going to be defiled. So I think in a couple of points, he's saying, I don't want people that have these physical issues inside the camp. They need to be outside. And also, B, I'm not going to dwell in the camp if they're going to be in there. So again, these waters of jealousy, and my mind also kind of goes back to the golden calf. We'll talk a little bit about that, how they ground that up and had to drink it, and that was a problem too for those who were exposed to be unfaithful to the Lord. So they're outside the camp in the Old Testament in Numbers. God tells them to be that. So if we go back and revisit the allegory of the rich man and Lazarus, it kind of seems that maybe the rich man or the Pharisee there has a legitimate argument. You know, why would he eat with somebody who had sores? Or the Pharisees, you know, why would I bring into the temple if somebody was born blind? Or why would I? And there were rules to not bring them in, but I think, why would I not? I shouldn't eat with somebody when they have sores like this. And we also know that there is this consistency between Jesus, where, like I said, the title was, I don't change. I'm not going to change. In John chapter 5:19, Jesus gave them this answer, verily, very truly, I tell you, the Son can do nothing by himself. He can do only what he sees his Father doing. Because whatever the Father does, the Son also does. So it's like, well, wait a minute. They see things totally the same. There is no space between them. There's no daylight. Also, in a previous chapter, John 4, verse 34, Jesus said to them, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work. So Jesus is basically doing his Father's work. There is no disparity between them. There is no differences. So how can we explain that? Well, if we go back to the Old Testament again, in Exodus 33, there was a tent of meeting. There was a couple of tents of meeting, but one of them was outside the camp. That tent of meeting was there. And it wasn't the one that was in the tabernacle, this particular one. And the one that was outside the camp was kind of a stopgap. And the reason it was a stopgap, basically because the tabernacle was being constructed, but also it was a stopgap of the transgression that the people had, and that was the golden calf. So they just get out of Egypt, and you know, I think sometimes I don't think about this as much, but they've been exposed to the Egyptian culture for hundreds of years, and they just come out, and you know, I sometimes think, well, you just flip a switch and they're going to be okay. Well, they weren't okay, and we know that from previous books, and when Ezekiel talks about it, and so do the other prophets, that time in Egypt was good for some, but for others they just couldn't give up that type of thing. And that kind of came out with the golden calf episode. But again, that tent of meeting was outside the camp. And in that tent of meeting, it says the Lord would speak to Moses face to face, as one speaks to a friend. And according to, this is according to Leviticus 33. Now, Moses used to take that tent and pitch it outside the camp, a distance away. He called it the tent of meeting. Anyone inquiring of the Lord would go to the tent of meeting outside the camp. Afterward, Moses would return to the camp, but the young man who assisted him, that was Joshua, that we know that brought him into the land, Joshua the son of Nun, he would remain behind in the tent of meeting. And remember, I think we all do, that Jesus is a translation in the Hebrew name Joshua, or Yeshua actually, and then we translate it into Joshua. So we can see, and I think many of us know, that Joshua was essentially a type of Christ, foretelling what he would do. So I think this relationship that Moses had along with Joshua was actually foretelling what the future was going to be, in a way, in their lives, and that they would represent Jesus. Joshua would, at least. And some would say Moses, in essence, was a type of God at that time. And in the Old Testament, in Leviticus 16, I'm going to paraphrase this, but this is about the sacrifices that took place. It said, the bull for the sin offering and the goat for the sin offering, whose blood was brought into the most holy place to make atonement, it must be taken outside the camp, and their hides, flesh, and the dung must be burned up. So why was that done? Why was it taken outside the camp and burned up? Well, it symbolized the removal of sin and the polluting effects of the presence, from the presence of God and the holy people of Israel. So the fact, or the act, that they burned it outside the camp was essentially telling the people that sin was abhorrent to God. He did not like it. It needed to be dealt outside the sacred space of the camp. And then later, that was the temple. It had to be outside of where God was dwelling. So it's kind of, and I think probably a little bit of an aside, but we know that when God was in the temple, that he finally left, and he tells Ezekiel why. It was just got totally corrupt, that was going on in there. So in essence, God does stay with his people during some very bad times, and we know he's always watching them, but sin is abhorrent to him. But at the same time, Exodus 29:45 tells us, it says, God declares, I will dwell among the children of Israel, and I will be their God. He's saying, that's what I want to do. That's where I want to be. And so as David looks at this in the 16th Psalm, verse 9, he says something that is quotable in the New Testament. But he said, therefore my heart is glad and my soul rejoices. My body also dwells secure, for thou dost not give me up to Sheol, or let thy godly one see the pit. So David's saying, well, my body dwells secure because the Lord does not let the godly one see the pit. Well, the last statement has to be messianic. It has to be talking about Jesus. Because if you visited Israel, you know that they have supposedly David's tomb, though it looks like it must have been Goliath inside, as big as it is. But David did see corruption. That's the point. He did see the pit. So what did he base his hope on? Well, we know what he did. And we know also that Paul uses that same phrase from Acts 13. He says, wherefore he saith also in another psalm, this is Paul talking, thou shalt not suffer thine Holy One to see corruption. So that's how important it was to Paul when he's talking to the people in Acts. And so this third day is what we usually talk about, where he doesn't see corruption. And that seems to be something that's important. So one of the things that makes it important was that on the third day, when they left Egypt, when they were slaves in Egypt and they left Egypt, they crossed the Red Sea to be born into a new nation. That was on the third day. That's what happened. And then Jesus, we know, uses the story of Jonah, right? On the third day. So 3 days happens to be important about the corruption. And then finally, we know that, remember who it was. Hosea states in that Hosea 6, he says, "Come, let us return to the Lord, for he has torn us, that he may heal us. He has struck us down, and he will bind us up. After 2 days, he will revive us, and on the 3rd day, he will raise us up, that we may live before him. Let us press on to know the Lord. His going out is sure as the dawn. He will come to us as the showers, as the spring rains that water the earth." So these are just 3 passages, and there are more. That 3rd day where the Holy One doesn't see corruption. And again, we know the Lord wants to tabernacle with his people. He wants to dwell with his people. But it becomes a stumbling block when transgression is there, when we sin. And that's why the sin had to be, in the terms of the flesh, had to be taken outside of the camp. And as I said earlier in Ezekiel 10, God's glory leaves the temple because of the widespread idolatry and sin that was going on in Israel at that time, more specifically Judah. So God withdrew his protection from them, and then there came judgment upon Israel, and it fell to Babylon. So the glory of God left the temple. So we know that the glory is not in a tent, or it's not in a temple building, but his glory comes to him through his Son. And how do we know that? Well, we know that from John 12. Verse 23 states, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified." Then later on in John 17, "Then Jesus looked up to heaven and said, Father, the hour has come. Glorify your Son, that your Son may glorify you." Acts 3 verse 13 said, "He is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who has glorified his servant Jesus." And so this glorification that Jesus receives through his Father, and that he glorifies his Father at the same time, goes on to 2 Thessalonians in kind of a different way, where it says in verse 12 of chapter 1, "So that the name of your Lord Jesus may be glorified in you, and you in him." So again, from what Jesus to the Lord, and Lord to Jesus, now it's us to him. Glorify Jesus. It said, "According to the grace of our God and the Lord Jesus Christ." And this glorification kind of leads us to Matthew 5, where he goes on to say, "Have you not read in the law how the Sabbath, the priests on the temple, profane the Sabbath and are guiltless?" Saying, hey, they go in on the Sabbath and they profane it because they're humans, but they're guiltless. And Jesus is saying, how can that be? Because he says, "I tell you, something greater than the temple is here." That something is Jesus. We keep that in mind. Greater than any temple that would build, any tent of meeting, any tabernacle. It's him. And that temple is confirmed again in John chapter 2, verse 19. Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." I think we're familiar with that. And then the Jews said, "It's taken 46 years to build the temple, and you raised it up in 3 days?" But he spoke of the temple of his body, the 3 days that was in the Old Testament. New Testament we talked about earlier, Jonah. So if we look at 1 Corinthians chapter 3, it says it outright. Paul tells the Corinthians, "Know ye not that ye are the temple of God?" He's telling them, you are the temple, and the Spirit of God dwells in you. So if any man defile the temple of God, him shall God destroy. For the temple of God is holy, which temple you are. So there doesn't seem to be any discrepancy between the Old and the New Testament in my mind. As David points out, these sins are going to be taken out. And I think in our brother Chuck's Corinthians class, one of the things that we talked about is the Corinthians really couldn't get this wrapped around their head. Like, what's this kingdom about? And he's saying, you're going to be changed. You're not going to be this sinner person anymore. That's going to be outside the camp. And I think that's what was being previewed in the Old Testament. Once they got outside of Egypt, I think God is showing them this is how it's going to work in the future. And I think the same thing happened when Jesus was raised from the dead in Acts, when you talk about it. As people will say, actually, in the reading, they'll say, hey, we know about Ananias and Sapphira. And it's like, well, that was kind of harsh. They just held back a few funds. I bet a lot of people did that. And I bet a lot of people did do that afterward in the Old and New Testament. But the point was, this is the new creation, and this type of thing is not going to be allowed. It's going to be outside the camp. And even though that's the case, it doesn't mean, as the Pharisees translated it in their minds, well, anything that's unclean, we keep away from it. We don't have anything to do with it, because basically our understanding is that can't be whole, that can't be holy at all. So we must keep away from it. We can't eat with a Lazarus. We can't show any help to a man born blind. But we do know that Ephesians 5 tells us, therefore be imitators of God as beloved children, and walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us. So that blood that was offered inside the camp was a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. So the blood that he was offered in the offerings in the Old Testament and what Jesus offered outside the camp, that blood was fragrant to God. And as David pointed out, the flesh, not so much, was sinful. Okay, before I close, I think I was going to talk about Mother's Day rather shortly here. But one of the things that came to my mind when I was thinking of it is in the book of Revelation. We know Revelation. And that book came down from God. It came to Jesus, and then it came to John, and then it came to the different seven ecclesias, right? So in my mind, I was thinking, so who did God and Jesus entrust that prophecy to? They entrusted it to John. They gave it to him. So how does that fit with Mother's Day? Well, maybe not so well as I think. But what I think is that when Jesus was being crucified, what did he do at the end? He says to his mother, behold your son. That's John. And he tells John, behold your mother. That's Mary. So you'd say, well, what? Okay, but I think that was pretty important, because did Mary have other families to take care of her? Yeah, I think she did. But Jesus is saying, the family you're going to be in is the family that at that time John is going to run. It's going to be a spiritual family. And I think both John and herself understood that. So to me, the fact that he entrusted his mother to this new family is pretty important to me anyway. So I think it showed how important it was to Jesus to do that. So I'm going to end in Hebrews chapter 5, where it said, for every high priest chosen from among the peoples, appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sin. He can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness. Because of this, he is bound to offer sacrifice for his own sins, as well as for the people. And one does not take the honor upon himself, but is called by God, just as Aaron was. So also Christ did not exalt himself to be made high priest, but was appointed by him who said to him, Thou art my son, today I've begotten thee. As he says also in another place, Thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him was able to save him from death. And he was heard for his godly fear. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he offered. And being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, being designated by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. So God doesn't change. Jesus did his Father's will. And I think things that seem to be inconsistent are really consistent with what the kingdom to come is going to be with Jesus as its ruler.